I'm going to go ahead and get us started so that we have the maximum amount of time here. We're expecting quite a few more people, but I'm guessing they will join as they see fit. So thank you so much for joining us. This is the beginning of a series hosted by ThirdWay Solutions about how to be anti-bias, anti-racist parents, leaders, organizations, institutions, and our hope is to provide some real practical and direct advice. I'm super excited and grateful to be joined today by Dr. Tanji Reed-Marshall and John King. I'm going to tell you about them in 1 second. Seems pretty fitting that we're here today, the day after Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, the day before the swearing in of the first Black, the first Asian, the first female vice president, and a week after a sort of unthinkable insurrection that was very much rooted in white supremacy and white privilege that played out for the world. We're going to get into all of that. So. But I just wanted to note the moment and appreciate everyone's time, given everything that's going on. It seems like a pretty important time to be having this conversation. So thank you for the time. I'm going to make quick introductions and we're going to dive right in. ThirdWay Solutions, which is the organization that I lead, is part of a movement to make sure that America's power tables and all levels of organizations represent the diversity of this country. We work with folks all over the country. EdTrust, which Tanji and John are senior leaders in, is a civil rights organization that uses research and pushes for equitable policy solutions to improve educational outcomes for underserved youth. Dr. Tanji Marshall, and she's graciously allowed me to call her Tanji for the purpose of this conversation, is the director of P12 practice at EdTrust. She's a longtime educator and advocate who's very passionate about literacy, among other things. She's also a mom, a wife, and a grandma to an unbelievably cute baby. We both agreed, like genuinely cute, you know, one of those. And John is the former Commissioner of Education for New York State, Secretary of Education under President Obama. He's also been a teacher, a principal, and he's now the CEO of Education Trust. And he is also a dad and my friend over many hats. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cami.
So first, anything I missed in your introductions or your description? I want to make sure I got it right. Okay. Perfect. All right, well, we are going to dive right in here then. I wanted to start by talking about the title of this webinar, How to Raise Anti-Biased, Anti-Racist Kids. Is that a good title? What does it mean to you? And I think part of what everyone's struggling with right now is what to call the work of realizing racial justice. So let's start there. Let's talk about what it means to you, if you think it's a good title, and if so, what does it mean to you? And if not, are there other ways we should be talking about this work?
I'm gonna let Tanji start.
Of course. Interesting, right? Because right before we came on, I talked to my 19-year-old son who has decided, well, who's home now because of COVID-19, he's a sophomore at Morehouse College. And I said, do you think we raised you to be anti-racist or anti-bias? And I was like, okay, you never know what your kid's gonna say to you, right? So, and he said, well, Mom, we didn't have the language of either of these things. So what I think you taught us how to do is to learn people, understand people, accept people. He said, but you did help us understand whiteness as a thing, right? I was like, oh, wow, we did, okay. That was kind of like impressive, right? So in terms of titles, I get a little bit anxious when I hear lots of jargon and lots of titles, because it becomes in education, this very sort of check boxable thing that I did it. If you tell me what the thing is, I know I can do the thing. But I think we do have to think about the kinds of ways we want people to operate in the world. So from an operational standpoint, I think, yes, that really is the right way to begin the conversation, from a right and wrong, if that's the right, those are the proper words. And anti-bias for sure, right? Knowing that bias is a component of, sort of the realization of the racist pieces and what it means to actively be against racism. I think when we talk about anti-racism, and I told you, Cami, I'm a lit head, right? So I start with the word anti, meaning I'm actively against being racist. And I think if we can really get people to understand what anti means from a structural standpoint and an operational standpoint, I think, yes, we're onto something right.
What do you think, John?
I agree with Tanji, and one of the things that stands out to me in her description is, her son saying that they built an understanding of whiteness and how it operates. And I think part of the challenge to all of us of the notion of anti-racist is that if we just say, be nice to everybody, don't discriminate based on race, that's actually not enough. That we actually have to help students and our kids understand that there are these systems that operate to preserve inequality, that racism is around us, and that just being neutral actually is not good enough. We have to be engaged in dismantling it. And I think that's really challenging to think about, right? Because then it means you have to sort of deconstruct the privileges that exist in different ways in our society. And in the last couple of years, obviously, especially last spring, when there was this sort of national reckoning with issues of racial justice, you heard a lot of folks saying, well, now I see there is this whole system operating behind things. And I think the challenge to us as educators and parents is, how do we make it so that that realization is a part of the educational process and growing up in America, coming to understand how these systems operate. So you don't have that moment of surprise. Like, I didn't know that was going on there, because it's always been there. It's been there since our beginning as a country.
And why do you think, John, can you just elaborate a little bit more on why isn't it enough to be sort of pro inclusion and pro, why is the language around anti-racism and anti-bias important?
Well, I think two reasons. One is, I think we have to understand that how things are today is tied up with that legacy. So if you think about something like the racial wealth gap, where you have these huge disparities in wealth between particularly African Americans and white Americans. At the level that in the city of Boston, I think the median net worth of white families is like $240,000, something like that, and the median net worth of Black families is $8. $8, like not 8,000, not 800, 8. And so how did that happen? Well, a lot of that has to do with home ownership and the way wealth is multi-generational. And so look at the current state and say, well, there are all these African Americans in Boston who are poor. There are all these white people who are wealthy. I guess that's how that's everybody ran the race and that's how it turned out. Well, no, how it turned out is tied up with our history of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and active employment discrimination today. So I think one is it's not accurate to teach a neutral, just be nice to everybody understanding without acknowledging the systems that got us to where we are. two is if we want to get to a better place, like it's going to take work. You know, you mentioned Dr. King's birthday yesterday. You know, one of my favorite lines of his was saying to his kids, never to think they're better than anyone else. And he would say, because you will never be what you ought to be until they are what they ought to be. Like your ability to live freely and to live the life you want is bound up with whether or not others have access to that opportunity. And so the work that we need to help our kids be prepared to do is to create justice in our society. And that can't happen just through passive, you know, I'm not going to participate in the bad stuff. No, you actually have to go out and do good stuff.
And Tanji, I'm thinking about why the anti-biased and anti-racist have, you know, together. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think in terms of being, there's a certain amount of, the power dynamic rooted in racism is different, right? As opposed to just being biased. So I can have bias about high heel shoes versus low heel shoes, right? Like to make it super concrete, right? I'm a bias towards that, right? So I'm gonna always like show up my bias around high heel shoes when I go shopping. If I'm racist though, I'm enacting a kind of epistemology and ideology that sort of interacts with actions that sort of keep other people out of opportunities and systematically relegates them to the margins, right? And so it's really around understanding how they both work in tandem, right? So these structural pieces of it operate in racism, and then you live your biases out in actions towards others in very individual, sometimes group ways. But I think we have to help people, adults and kids, understand how the power dynamic around racism works, which is what, you know, when John said, you can't be neutral. It's like when you're driving and you're on the yellow line. I grew up in New York. So, you know, if you stay on the yellow line, you get hit by traffic going both ways. Right. So you cannot be on the yellow line here. You have to be actively undoing, actively addressing what you know to be structurally racist principles and practices. And I think what happens is we take racism and reduce it to bias, which means we constantly relegate it to individual bad people, individual bad actions. Mm-hmm. And so that is why there's always a surprise, because, well, I don't do those things that we saw, right? And the people I know don't do those things. And so if we leave it at that sort of overly reductive level of bias, it creates an escape hatch so we don't have to deal with systems. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to get to the system level in order to really be what we say. And then the question is, do we actually want to be who we say we are on paper? Yeah. Or do we just want those for certain people? So maybe that's a starting point of asking ourselves, you know, do we really want to be the things we purport on paper?
Yep, that's powerful. I mean, I think also just bluntly, white families don't talk enough about race. I mean, white families often can opt in and opt out when it gets hard. And so at least in our work, we found it really important to be explicit about anti-racism, in part because oftentimes folks who hold privilege can look away, and it's in the looking away, right, that the enabling passes generationally, right? So, and also the anti-bias piece, you know, we see lots of data, I know you two, around students with disabilities, second language learners, you know, kids who identify as LGBTQ. So race is always omnipresent, as are, you know, other things that show up in, you know, in our lives. So, you know, we've sort of taken to embracing both and for the reasons that you've stated. anything else on that topic? I want to sort of take us to a little bit about you all.
Sure.
I think we'll probably get more into it as well. So John, I want to start with you. There was a 2019 Washington Post article about an incredible journey that you and your family went on. And I think it's directly related to this topic. It's also a beautiful piece. So tell us about that. Tell us about what happened, and also specifically why you chose to do what you did, and kind of how it relates to your views on anti-bias, anti-racist parenting.
Yeah. So, well, it started that when I was secretary, I was asked to give the commencement address at University of Maryland Eastern Shore. It's a historically Black college out on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I was asked to give the commencement address because my grandmother graduated from there in 1894. So she was among the first classes to graduate from UMES. And in preparation for giving the commencement, I started this research project. And the research project was to really understand more about my family history in Maryland and how my grandmother came to be at University of Maryland Eastern Shore in 1894, which was quite unusual for an African-American woman. And I started working with a friend of a friend who was kind of genealogist at the Schomburg in New York City, the part of the New York City public library system that focuses on African-American history. And one night I'm sitting with my family, we're watching TV, and I get an email from her, and she says, I've made this discovery that turns out your great-grandfather was enslaved in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is where I live, about 25 miles from where I live in Gaithersburg. I live in Silver Spring. And so, you know, I mean, as an African-American, you sort of know that there's this tie to slavery, but to be able to identify the place was very striking and unusual. But then there was more, and she says, and actually the property is still owned by the direct line descendants of the family that owned your family. And they've maintained the property just as it was in 1863. And on the property is the enslaved people's quarters that your family lived in. And here's the Google map image, Google Earth image of the place. So that was sort of jarring and surprising. And then we started this whole conversation as a family. Well, what do we do with this? You know, do we just show up? Do we write an email? Do we call? Like, how do we, you know, obviously we want to go see this property, but how do we do that? Well, my cousin, who is a very assertive person, she and her husband were visiting. They live in North Carolina, but they were up in DC visiting the African American History Smithsonian Museum, and decided we're just going to go see it. So they just drove over to the property, knocked on the door, and said, "Hello, our ancestors lived here," and started a conversation. And so that's grown in the Washington Post piece profiles of this relationship that we've built with the Becker family as we've learned about our history. And so I've been able, with my daughters who are 14 and 17, to stand in the cabin where my great-grandfather lived as an enslaved person with his siblings and his mother. And it's been this fascinating journey about how we came to be who we are as Americans, right? The enslaved people's quarters are maybe 30 yards from the main house. So you really get this profound sense of the intimacy of the institution of slavery. I mean, here are these two families living together in the same space, but one owned the other. In getting to know the Beckers, I've really seen how, even though they grew up on this property that is a plantation, they hadn't necessarily had a lot of conversation about slavery as an institution or what it meant or that part of their family history. So we've had some difficult conversations, even us saying like, we don't say slaves, we say enslaved people because they were people with full lives who were oppressed by this institution. We don't want to deprive them of their humanity with the word slave. We've had a lot of conversations about the complicated history around the Civil War. Their ancestors served in the Confederacy. Even though Maryland stayed on the Union side, many Marylanders fought for the Confederacy, including the Becker's ancestors. We've had a lot of conversation about what do Confederate monuments mean, and what is their role in our society. My great-grandfather's younger sister actually reported her owner for consorting with the Confederates, which he was, and he was put on trial in Baltimore for consorting with the Confederates. And she, as a 15-year-old enslaved young woman, testified about his cooperation with the Confederates. So we have this, our two families are embodiments of a lot of truths about American history. And it's been a blessing. It's been a blessing to know that history and to get to know them. And has sparked a lot of conversation about how we as a country move forward and the kinds of conversations we should be having about the institution of slavery, which was really not that long ago, and which is profoundly bound up with the evolution of the country.
So powerful. I mean, we could do a whole session just on this. Why did you, I mean, I kind of love the story of your cousin just like knocking on the door, but why did you feel like it was important to sort of lean in or not look away from, this all information kind of came your way, but you also actively pursued it. I'm curious, why did you do that?
Well, I want my girls and the next generation of our family to understand our roots, our history. And I also think there's some work we have to do across lines of race in America to just grapple with the reality of how we came to be here. Like you're right. I mean, I think there is a temptation to look away for everybody, for Black folks, for white folks, for everybody. And I guess I think it's important that we try to draw lessons from some of what Germany has tried to do about the kind of legacy of the Holocaust, that they have plaques in front of houses about the family that lived there, that was stolen from that house and taken to the camps to be killed. Like part of ensuring that something like that doesn't happen again is grappling with the harsh reality of it. And I think that's work we need to do individually and collectively.
And Tanji, I want to bring you in here a little. Obviously, I agree wholeheartedly, and I know that there is a lot of temptation among everyone, but particularly among folks who feel like, oh, I don't know how to do this. I'm going to engage in the conversation wrong. So I'll just, sort of stay in my safe space. So I'm just two questions for both of you, and I'm going to start with you. One is just what advice can we, or what would we say to folks that are like, yeah, I hear you theoretically, but I don't have the skill set or the history or the toolkit to do it properly, to steer into our legacy around slavery? That's one. And the other is kind of what's the balance? And I know we struggle with this in our own home between really leaning into the tough conversations on structural racism and how it sort of shaped America, but also, that Black history didn't start with slavery, right? We have so few images and we have such a white normative way we teach history and whatnot that's part of it too, right? That it's the both and of celebrating Black excellence and Black history that is predates and also really grappling with the sort of legacy of slavery. So I guess I'm looking, maybe we'll start with the last one. How do we sort of do both, like wrestle with the tough stuff, more than that, like actually lean into the tough stuff, and also, embrace a wider Black history.
I think one of the things I tell people who ask similar questions around that, it's not necessarily yes, you have your own grappling, but because these are actual events that happened, you're not going out making up stuff. So like the information that you seek is there because it happened. And so when we talk about, I don't have the skill set or whatever, if you are a person fortunate enough to have the privilege of tinkering inside the brains of someone else's child, which means you're a teacher, you then have content at your ready, right? And the content is shaped around critical questions, around the tension of America's identity as an exceptional place rooted and grounded in, democracy and freedom and liberty. So how do we help students, even very young students, begin to understand the tension between we believe these things, yet, right, these other things happen. So if we look at John's family as a basis for an example, there's a critical tension that undergirds how both sides of that family really understand what it means to be an American person. And so if I'm thinking about, I don't have the skill set can be rooted in how you are helping students begin to understand America as a construct itself that came into being in 1776 as a thing, as a named thing, but then how do you understand that, almost 100 years later, they had to fight to free people, right? Like, how do you help people understand the tensions between that? And in terms of Black history in America, in the United States of America, started at a particular time. The history of African people all obviously supersedes that, right? And so when we talk about, how do we know that Black history doesn't begin with Black people in the United States, we know that, but there is a certain construct of being a Black American that actually did start here. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we then help students understand that this thing about being an African person started before Africans were brought to the United States, and there is a Black American construct that was built because those Africans were stolen and brought here, right? So really thinking about the questions that really lend themselves to using history for the answers, right? We rely a lot on the humans to come up with the answers when the answers are already there, right? You look at primary documents, you look at got the Green Book about a few weeks back. The Green Book wasn't a movie, right? It became a movie because certain events happened that created the need for there to be a Green Book. So we're looking at the adults to have the answer when the answer lies in the actual events that took place, which have been documented. Sometimes the rub becomes, though, there's so much buried information. How can we get to the buried information? But I think really asking questions of ourselves and of our students around the tension between America as the shining light on the hill, while it simultaneously, actively, judiciously works to keep whole groups of people, primarily those of color, specifically Black Americans and Indigenous people, sort of on the margins. right? Like we talk about like the entire near erasure of a group of people who were here, like they were here before, you know, European Americans got here. And so I think those are the kinds of, you know, tools, when we think this as a tool perspective, getting people to think through asking critical questions that really then rely on the history, that really then rely on the use of really great literature, right? That can help you weave the story together. I think is how when people ask me that question, is how I really sort of steer and help them navigate it.
Thank you. Let's do a little real-time advice, if we would. And by the way, to anyone listening in, you can, you know, feel free to, I see folks are starting to put questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask maybe about 5-10 minutes more, and then we'll take some of your questions. So the Q&A is open. Feel free to place some questions in there. I want to sort of like, there's all this planning we all do to you know, really be proactive in helping our students wrestle with, and our kids wrestle with paradoxes and questions and whatnot. And then something like last week happens, right? We see a predominantly or almost exclusively white group of insurrectionists go into the Capitol, you know, practically welcomed with open arms and in stark juxtaposition to what we saw with Black Lives Matter protests. You know, we see the roots of that, you know, that's sort of the end of like 4 years of like really explicit stoking, very directly related to white supremacy and white privilege. So what did you, I mean, what did you say to your kids about that? Like, how did you unpack that with them? I know both of you, I know John, your kids are older, mine sort of like, not like, let's talk about what you, like literally like what you said, and then let's like try to see if we could give some advice to folks who might have younger kids, because in some ways, right, like that's like easier and trickier all at once, you know? So what do you think, John? What did you?
Yeah, I mean, it was very painful because, you know, it happened that I was between meetings, and my younger daughter is 14. She had just finished class. And so we happened to be in the kitchen at the same time when the TV was on, and it was images of the folks like literally storming the building. And so we just sat for a bit and just watched together. And Maria's observation was, as many people have observed since, well, imagine if this had been Black Lives Matter protesters, because our family had been out in Lafayette Square in front of St. John's Church the night before folks were sent in to clear out the protesters. So we were literally standing in the spot that the next night folks were hit with tear gas and pushed out with batons. And so that was very searing, seeing those images after just a day after we'd been there at the Black Lives Matter protest. So from Maria, when she was seeing what was happening at the Capitol, she was trying to reconcile that with what we saw happen with Black Lives Matter protesters. And of course, she and her sister had followed on social media just all the ways that police responded with incredible force to often peaceful protests around the country. So, you know, we talked about how this is a manifestation of a strand of our history as a country. Like it's not surprising in a sense that one of the insurrectionists was waving a Confederate flag in the Capitol, because there is this tradition in American political history of kind of leveraging hate and fear as a force to maintain systems of oppression. And so we talked about that, and what I could see that she wanted, and I couldn't give was reassurance that this is as bad as it gets and we're going up from here. I hope that's right. And I also know that there is this strand in our kind of historical being as a country. And there's work that we need to do to dismantle that. You know, I think about someone we both know, DeRay McKesson, who was a Black Lives Matter protester, is and an activist. And DeRay will say, hope is not magic, hope is work. And so I can't say it will be better for sure, but I can say we in our family, in our household, we're going to do the work to try to make it better. And in that, there is hope and reason for optimism for the country. But it's hard. I don't have like a pat answer for how to talk about it, because it's just hard. It's a painful thing, and it's not isolated. One of the things we have to be careful of is not make it seem like last week's events were a complete shock and aberration. They are the product of something quite long-standing.
Yep. What about you, Tanji? Thank you.
I think one, right? So it's a product of, I think what we keep not wanting to talk about is this disaffection of white males that has been brewing for such a long time, and then exacerbated when President Obama was elected, and then elected again. It just kept seething. And then we lived our unwillingness to face the reality of the tension between what we call ourselves and how we operate. In Germany and South Africa, they dealt with, truth and reconciliation. We want reconciliation. We don't want truth. Right? We refuse day in and day out to name ourselves in the tension. We just won't do it. And, John and I doing some work on curriculum, and one of the things that we talk about is when you start, we can tell teachers how to use pedagogy and instruction to be relevant to the culture and the children in front of them. When we start asking people to go through the history curriculum, you get your biggest pushback, because to do so means you're going to bump up against the ideal of America and the degree to which we want children to learn about who America is. America has done great things. America has done terrible things. Both of those are truth, but we lean so heavily on the great things. You and I were talking, as I was reviewing something for a school district, and they say to become a US citizen means you're born in this country. That's only half true, because to not talk about the fact that a person can become a US citizen through a naturalization process is to then eliminate immigrants who are naturalized US citizens as much as every American born person. Right then and there, these are for kindergartners. So if we're laying down the foundation of inaccuracy at the kindergarten level, what are we doing? So there's no wonder that a person who has lived 12 years in a school system where the grounding of what it means to be a citizen was inaccurate, how then are they supposed to rethink that a person who's an immigrant and became a citizen is as much a citizen as they who are born here?
Yep. So let's stay on this for a second, and start to maybe talk brass tacks about resources. So let's say I'm a parent and I actually read all those inaccuracies, maybe more. I didn't have you or John as as a parent. And I want, and maybe I realized that 10 years ago, maybe I realized it 10 minutes ago. What should I be doing? What should I be reading? What should I be, who should I be talking to? What should I be thinking about? Because to your point, Tanji, a lot of folks have been undereducated or miseducated about the role that race has played in our founding, and we're all now parents, right? So we have to sort of undo, on some level, unlearn. So maybe let's spend a few minutes, and then I'm going to go to some of the audience questions about how do you do that? Like, what are some of the things that you do, or you recommend? You know, let's try to do a rapid fire round. So if people are listening, they're like, oh, you know, talk resources.
First thing is this, I tell people, this is the information age. The magic of Google, the magic of something, you know, every piece of information you want to know is at your fingertips. That being said, there are things like Facing History is a resource, right? Like that's an organization rooted in helping schools and families understand America's history in totality. Things like Teaching Tolerance, that's another organization. You know, they have a magazine, they have resources, they're all free. You know, looking at that and then asking a question on Google. The other day, myself, and I feel like I'm smart most days, like most days, Monday through Friday, I kind of know stuff, right? But then there's like Thursday, and then who knows, I might not know anything. And so I had a question about something that was said about Dr. King that I was unsure about. Someone had named him as something. I was like, I don't think that's right. And so me, with a lot of resources, still had unanswered questions. And there's enough cannot be said about the ability to ask Google a question. You know, does Dr. King, you know, was Dr. King this or that? You know, how to become a US citizen. I think one of the most interesting aspects of what's happening with families and students now with this learning that we're doing remotely is that parents are inside the learning, right? All the veils are done, parents are seeing things, and they can ask their own questions, right? And they can really begin to help their child ask their own questions as well. And I think there's a power in really beginning to ask critical questions and get into the tension, because kids are watching from very young until very, you know, they're watching what's happening on television. There's a 5-year-old out there that saw what happened on January 6th, and that child has some serious questions, right? You know, the President-elect Biden's granddaughter was the one that sent him the image, or that raised the question about what would have happened had this been a Black Lives Matter. So students are asking questions, and we have to be willing to name things, like I said, Facing History, name things like the People's History, Howard Zinn, name things like Teaching Tolerance, and, you know, just, again, getting on Google and asking a simple question.
Thank you. John, you want to, thank you for those. You're on mute, John. So whatever you said was brilliant.
I agree with what Tanji said. I would add a couple ideas. One is to do an equity audit of your home library, and if, depending on your relationship with the school and teacher, to have them do the same. But are there authors, you know, are there Black authors, are there Latino authors, are there Asian American authors represented? And are there diverse stories told? Because if in the library all the stories about Black people are about slavery and the civil rights movement, that's not enough. Like, there's more to the Black American experience than that. And so you got to have those diverse texts, and then read them together with your children and talk about them, and talk about issues of race and how they play out, and understanding across differences. I would think about a book like Brown Girl Dreaming, which is this amazing kind of book that is all poetry, and had some amazing conversations with my girls about that. So figuring out text-based conversations you can have, that's one. Two is thinking about where you travel to and what you see. I mean, there's something really powerful about walking through that, the Smithsonian, the African American History and Culture Museum, and walking through the multiple floors that tell the story of the African American historical experience. Something very powerful about standing in front of shackles that were created for an enslaved toddler. What does that say about the institution of slavery? And seeing that in the museum is powerful. And you know, thinking about also art museums in the community and historical sites in the community and the Underground Railroad site in the community, what have you, just being physically in spaces that raise these questions. Thinking about the communities that kids experience. Who are the adults and peers that they interact with, and do they have opportunities to get to know people who are different from them and to have experiences that are different from their cultural experience? And being intentional about those things is hard. And I'll say, we haven't done it perfectly in our family, but we try to be thoughtful about how we create those opportunities and then can talk about them. Like, what was different between the quinceañera and the bat mitzvah, and what were some of the traditions in common and different? And like, those kinds of conversations I think are important to have.
Yeah, and I would also just add for the question came up again in the Q&A about, white folks with anxiety who may feel like they're earlier in their work. And so I would also just add your own life audit, right? How much, what as a parent, what do you consume, right? Are you only reading white authors, listening to white podcasts, being in white spaces? Have you put yourself in a position where you're the only, and have you observed your own behavior when that happens? And have you taken the Harvard IIT bias test, which is really, it's not perfect, but it sort of forces you to do a bunch of things that like sort of see, what images you're positively biased towards and what images you're negatively biased towards. Have you done that and then gotten the report and sat with that, right? Like, so if you as a parent or an educator or a leader haven't done that personal journey work, it's hard to show up. Honestly, kids sometimes are just like way more they're just, they're leaning into the paradoxes and the questions, and they're often asking the tough questions that sometimes adults aren't ready for, especially this generation, right? So I would just say I'm partly answering a question there, and also just in my own network, the only thing that's not okay is like, well, I'm afraid I'm going to do it wrong, so I'm going to stay on the sideline. But I'm not going to like practice or put myself in spaces where I have to practice. I'm just going to like observe that I might do it wrong and just like stay in that observation. Like that's not the place to stay. John, you look like you might want to add something to that.
No, I agree with you. And I think, there is this risk that the fear of saying the wrong thing or making a mistake causes people to choose passivity. And to go back to where we began, passivity is complicity. And so we need to be courageous to take some risks.
I'm going to ask a few questions from the Q&A that have come up. So one we just talked about. I think there's one that resonates with me, and I'm curious if it does with you all, about just the tension between where your own kids go to school. So we're now in a predominantly white neighborhood for the first time in my son's schooling. The last couple of years, we were in mostly Black schools, and now we're in a mostly white school. And just, I think there's a perception that whiter schools are better, which is not always true. And just how do you think about making choices about schools and neighborhoods where your kids may or may not be exposed to diversity? I think I'm just curious what advice or thoughts you have about that. I mean, I know it's sort of like a perennial question, but hey, that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, That's a tough one because we moved from North Carolina to Virginia, and our son was attending private school in North Carolina. And when he came here, he attended public school, but the public school here was there wasn't that much difference between the public school here and the private school he attended. And so, as I had done with him and his friends, really understood the limitations of what he would be learning. And then, so he would go to summer school with his mom every summer, which he loved to hate, but did it anyway, because those were required opportunities in our family. And so he had to do that. And so I think what has to happen is when parents are making decisions about schooling, you have to ask yourself, what are your non-negotiables? What's a must-have, right? There are some real serious must-haves. And then outside of your must-haves, what then are you able to do to ensure that whatever holes may exist, you then have some measure of wherewithal, either through public funding, libraries, your school, your community resources, your own personal resources, to help fill some of those gaps in. We knew there were going to be some gaps in content, and so we were prepared to have a structure in place to address them. Not every family has that, and I'm certainly well aware of that. But I think when parents are making that decision, and why there's this assumption that white schools are better from what appears to be a resource perspective. Mm-hmm. In 1935, Dr. DuBose asked the question, should Black kids even be going to school with white teachers? He asked it in 1935 because he understood that the person who was part of the oppressor is going to teach the oppressed from a very particular perspective. And so he began to push and challenge on that. And so we don't necessarily think about white schools through that lens. And so we think about, they tend to look better. They tend to have more. So from our limited understanding of better, that's how we rate those schools, right? Their numbers are better unless we kick the tires and realize the disparities that are there. But I think that has to be a question about what are the must-haves, and then what are some critical questions parents can be asking of the school around discipline, around course selection and availability, around content of the curriculum, around teaching practice. So those are the ways in which they can really get at some of the must-haves when they make decisions about schooling for their kids.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that, I think for us, we saw racial and socioeconomic diversity as core to what would make a good school for us. And so we chose Montgomery County, Maryland because of that. And we kind of approach our kind of family advocacy around housing and school policy with that in mind. And so part of the challenge in this moment is you see folks who have a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, but they're also showing up to oppose mixed income housing being constructed in the neighborhood. It's very hard to reconcile those things. Or people with the Black Lives Matter sign in their yard and they're opposed to any change in school assignment zones in the district that might cause their local elementary school to be more racially diverse. Well, how do you reconcile those things? So I think part of our challenge is, how do we translate the rhetorical commitment to racial justice issues into the actions and policies that give substance to those words?
Well, I'm looking at an eye towards the clock, and I know I have a million more questions, but we don't have a lot more time. I want to make sure that that I give you each, I'm going to start with you, Tanji, and then you, John, just any, my gosh, if you take anything away from this today, here's what I hope, just to, so kind of give you the last word, and then I'll sort of wrap it up and give some instructions at the end. So Tanji, just kind of thinking about this topic, how to raise anti-bias, anti-racist kids. If there's a couple things you really hope folks hear from you, maybe something I haven't asked, or what the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. One, it was a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share. I think what we have to get to is take our blinders off. If we learn nothing else, take off the blinders of who America is so that we can stop being shocked, so that we can then get down to the business of being the America we say we are. Really do that. And I think the other thing is be active. Be active, ask the tough questions. We live in the information age. You can find out anything. And then take responsibility for yourself. If you are a white person on a journey, it isn't my job as a Black woman to teach you. That's your job to learn. And if I'm a Black person also on my own journey, because I'm on my own journey, I need to be in conversation with, right? I need to be in my own understanding with others as well. So those are my top 3. Be in conversation with others.
John?
Yeah, I would just build on that last point about being in conversation with others and tie it to a question in the chat about folks who are supporters of the 45th president. So, we are all together in this country. John Lewis had a thing he would say, we got here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. And I do not want to give up on my fellow Americans. So my view is that we have to stay in conversation and try to move folks. I mean, if you think about Dr. King and the civil rights movement, part of that movement, at the center of that movement, was an appeal to moral conscience, right? It was the notion that human beings fundamentally, at their core, have the capacity for love and mercy and justice. And sometimes there's a lot of layers between that and how they are in the world. But we've got to dig through and try to appeal to that core. And so I want to stay in conversation with folks whose politics are different from mine, whose views about our history are different from mine. And I want to keep trying to move us forward. And I realize that there are also forces that try to leverage division in order to protect their interests. And so I don't want to give in to that. And so I feel like we are in a struggle, and we've got to keep making the moral case for a more just future.
Well, I think that's an awesome place to end. We will make this recording available to you all, to everyone who's listening in, to anyone who registered. We hope more people watch. We'll also include links to all the resources that were mentioned here. And just in the spirit of both of our incredible panelists, stay in conversation. The sidelines are the only non-option, and take it upon yourself to be more educated tomorrow than you are today, including and especially when it's uncomfortable. So I think that's our message from Third Way. So thank you both so much for your time, and thanks to everyone who listened in.
Thanks, Cami. Thank
you, Cami. Bye.